Hello there, and of course, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, or Happy Kwanzaa if you are celebrating. And welcome to a report on Scottish politics of the week. A range of measures to help children, parents, and carers with costs around school have been set out in the Scottish Government's budget. These include expansion of free school meals in primary schools, holiday food provision, and investment to ensure the school clothing grant national minimum of £120 for primary pupils and £150 for secondary pupils. The spending plan for 23-24 allocates £4.85 billion of funding across the education and skills portfolio, including measures to address the cost of living crisis. New investment will see free school meals expanded to primary 6 and 7 pupils in receipt of the Scottish Child Payment, the next step in Scottish Government plans to deliver universal free school meals in primary schools. It also includes £22 million of continued support to provide meals during the school holidays to children who need them most, along with £200 million for the Scottish Attainment Challenge. In addition, the budget allocates £50 million of funding to continue to support the whole family well-being programme of activity, a key pillar to the promise to support families to thrive. The Gender Recognition Reform Bill has been supported by the Scottish Parliament. The legislation improves the system by which transgender people can apply for legal recognition through a Gender Recognition Certificate or GRC. Trans people aged 16 and older applying for a GRC will be required to make a legally binding declaration that they are already living in their acquired gender and intend to do so permanently. The bill includes safeguards against misuse of the system. It will be a criminal offence for applicants to make a false application. A new statutory aggravator and a risk-based approach in relation to sex offences strengthen these protections. Trans people have been able to apply for legal gender recognition through a gender recognition certificate since 2004. Not all trans people have a GRC and no one is required to have one. Removing the current requirement under the Gender Recognition Act 2004 for applications to have evidence of a diagnosis of gender dysphoria aligns with international best practice and the consensus view of United Nations human rights bodies. Applicants must make a statutory declaration that they have lived in the acquired gender for at least 3 months before applying, 6 months for 16 and 17 years old. Making a false application will carry a maximum penalty of imprisonment for up to 2 years or an unlimited fine or both. There is also a provision in the bill for a person with interests such as the Registrar General to make an application to the sheriff on the grounds an application was fraudulent. For the first time, parole board rules will specify the failure to disclose a victim's body as a matter which can be taken into account when deciding a person's release from prison. The move is one of a number of planned rule changes laid before Parliament. They aim to modernize and simplify the current procedures, which are more than 20 years old. Under the changes, which take effect in April, certain victims registered with Part 1 of the Victim Notification Scheme will also be able to choose if they wish to get information on the decision relating to the person involved in their case, rather than the decision summary being automatically sent to them. Some just don't want this. This move, by enabling victims to opt out of such notifications, aims to avoid re-traumatization. It builds on the Scottish Government's other recent parole reforms, such as the right for victims to observe parole proceedings and its wider vision to put victims at the heart of the justice system. The new rules will also include a new procedure allowing the parole board to reconsider cases under certain conditions where a decision has been made not to release a person. The parole board will also be able to appoint a representative on behalf of prisoners who lack capacity to appoint one themselves. The new rules will come into force, as I said, on April 1st. Plans to protect the use of the professional term lawyer have been unveiled as part of proposals to reform the regulation of Scotland's legal services sector. The move would see the legal role given greater protection in law to prevent unqualified people and those who have been struck off from using it. A formal consultation response published last week underpins the Scottish Government's commitment to reforming legal services and to retaining the sector's independence within a system that provides greater flexibility in how complaints are handled, to benefit both consumers and legal professionals. The response also sets out how the existing regulatory framework for legal services should be modernized to provide users with increased confidence, support growth in the sector, and strengthen consumer protections. Publication of the position follows extensive stakeholder engagement with legal professionals and will inform legislation to be introduced to the Scottish Parliament. The report of the Independent Review of Legal Services Regulation in Scotland, the so-called Roberton Report, made 40 recommendations intended to reform and modernize the existing legal services regulatory framework to provide a proportionate approach to regulation while supporting growth and competitive provision within the legal services sector, and place consumer interests at its heart. While many of the recommendations were widely supported, the primary recommendation to establish a single independent regulator for all legal services in Scotland largely polarised the views of stakeholders. As a result, the Scottish Government made the commitment to undertake a public consultation with the intention of seeking to build consensus on the way forward. Details of how more than £13.2 billion in Scottish Government funding for 2023-24 will be distributed among local authorities, and that has been published now. They include a cash increase in day-to-day revenue funding of 3.5% for next year compared with the 2022-23 Scottish budget. The settlement represents a total cash increase of £570 million or 4.5%. This is equivalent to a real term rise of 1.3% to support all vital council services and follows the most challenging Scottish budget settlement since devolution. The Scottish Government has enabled local authorities to make their own local decisions with financial flexibility on council tax, employability and homelessness services, as well as early learning and school workforce provisions. Ministers have reached an agreement with social landlords on below-inflation rent increases for the next financial year. Organizations representing social landlords have announced their members' plans for average rent increases for 2023 and 24, which will keep rents significantly below private market levels. Under the Cost of Living Act 2022, rents are effectively frozen in the social rented sectors until March 31st. Decisions on future plans for the private sector rent freeze, as well as other measures contained in the Act, will be announced in the coming weeks. COSLA and the Scottish Federation of Housing Association, or SFHA, have published statements setting out their members' intentions for rent in 2023-24. COSLA has committed to keeping local authority rent increases to an average of no more than £5 a week. Members of the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations and Glasgow West of Scotland Forum of Housing Associations have reported planned increases averaging 6.1%. The reference to average figures rather than a fixed cap allows for the flexibility to honor the outcomes of the statutory tenant consultations that social landlords must undertake each year on rent setting. No social landlord is consulting on a rent increase at or above CPI inflation, which was 11.1% at the time of the data being collected. Scotland's onshore wind capacity will more than double by 2030 under plans to help cut harmless emissions and support the energy sector's net zero transformation. The finalised onshore wind policy statement published this week confirms the Scottish Government's ambitions for 20 gigawatts of onshore wind power to be installed by 2030. This could generate enough electricity to power the equivalent of 19.5 million homes per year. Currently, around 8.7 gigawatts of onshore wind is operational. An onshore wind strategic leadership group will be formed to develop an onshore wind sector deal in 2023 to maximize supply chain and community benefit opportunities from the sector's expansion. The policies set out in the revised draft National Planning Framework 4, currently before Parliament for approval, would ensure that the planning system enables the growth of this zero-carbon sector while continuing to protect Scotland's most valued natural assets and cultural heritage. The Net Zero, Energy and Transport Secretary announced the finalised onshore wind policy statement to Parliament on Wednesday, December 21st, and at the same time confirmed that the draft energy strategy and just transition plan will be published in early January. There was a written question and answer there. The Scottish Parliament you can get it at the Scottish Parliament. The sector deal will be a shared commitment between government and industry to deliver upon government ambitions and ensure that in the sector, when it grows in a way that aligns with the principles of a just transition to net zero. Thousands of vulnerable households will be supported by the continuation of the Scottish Government's uprated £20 million Fuel Insecurity Fund. Announced as part of last week's Scottish Budget 23-24, the investment will enable third sector partners to continue to provide support to households who are at risk of self-disconnection or self-rationing their energy use. While the Scottish Government remains committed to engaging with the UK Government to deliver a referendum on Scottish independence, funding that was originally earmarked for a referendum in 2023 will now be used to help tackle fuel poverty. Last week's Scottish budget included additional steps to address inequality while tackling the climate emergency, including increased investment of over £366 million next year to support the delivery of the heat and building strategy. It forms part of a package of measures introduced by the Scottish Government to protect the most vulnerable households from the impact of the current cost of living crisis. The decisions taken through the emergency budget review in November enabled the Scottish Government to provide additional immediate support to people most impacted by the cost of living crisis, specifically rising energy prices, by doubling the Fuel Insecurity Fund to £20 million this year. The Scottish budget is now protecting that investment into 23-24. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon and Minister for Zero Carbon Buildings Patrick Harvey met with people on the front line of tackling fuel poverty while visiting the WISE Group in Glasgow, a social enterprise working to lift people out of poverty by providing mentoring support to help with employment and life skills and offering energy advice. And you have just seen the start of a little series that I will do whenever there's enough to report on. On holidays, there will not be that much to report from current decisions in neither Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland. Because today, this was the Scottish report, but also there will be a Welsh and a Northern Irish report, and I try to do this regularly. And I'll see you in my next video. I'll be back.